Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 301. We are over that hump, and here we go into the next 300. I am your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man, and this episode is on a question from Adcott T, whose question doesn't appear to be on the episode anymore. It was on episode number 231, although I will check, just to make sure, I will check 232. I don't think it's there, but I'll check it. So, this was a question, and of course I don't have the whole wording on it, but it's a question about Russia. I assume he was just asking about Russia. Now, the last episode, I believe, I talked about different countries in general, and I'm really not sure what more I can say about Russia. Although, it's worth pointing out, as I often do, that in Max Brooks' book, World War Z, he talks at length about the situation in Russia. Now, there are a lot of different facets of what he talks about, from the military point of view to the civilian point of view, and even the point of view of a priest, I believe. But that really isn't particularly relevant to this show. This show we talk about trains a lot. Russia is one of the countries, or was, I suppose, that had a strategic steam reserve prior to World War Z. That said, to my understanding, the entire strategic steam reserve was disbanded many years before World War Z started. As far as I know, the last strategic steam reserve engine of any country was Swedish, I think, and it was taken out of service, and I believe given to a museum, in 2009. So, it had been a number of years since that had happened, but Russia having a fairly extensive system of railroads, I could believe that something similar to the zombie train would have happened over there. That said, things were, I hesitate to call them more orderly, but they were a little bit more organized than we were here in North America during the war. They didn't have the kind of situation where they lost, they lost basically the whole country in terms of control, and they had to get it back. The reasoning for this, for the most part, being the fact that they are the Great White Wilderness, and zombies couldn't really get around up there. As far as I know, the major cities were hit just as hard as any other, but the populace, especially outside of the major cities, did fairly well as far as I understand. And they waged a pretty comprehensive campaign to get those cities back under control. To this day, they're still fighting a lot, mostly much farther north, in areas that got kind of ignored early on, but nonetheless were infected. But during the war itself, you had a few different things going on. You had basically the government, which was doing its best to eradicate the zombie populations within Russia. You had the Russian mafia, who was not actively helping that, and was instead trying to expand Russian influence in Eastern Europe, and even farther into Europe, as a matter of fact. And they were the people that we came up against when we were trying to get the, I guess you'd call them scientists, engineers, the people that we took out of Europe to help our petrol situation, our oil situation. And I do call them the Russian Mafia. I'm not totally sure, but they were definitely more of an organized crime thing and not a government entity of Russia. The only reason I know this is because I do know that the government entities of Russia were heavily focused on what was going on Russian soil, and not focused on everything else. They did not care about what was going on, not on Russian soil. Good for them, I guess. So, the Navy, the Russian Navy, and this is where things really get hairy, and where I had the most interaction, although indirect, with Russia. They were not waging war, but they came very close to waging war, not just with a lot of settlements in the Pacific, which happened. There were a couple of instances of people lashing large ships together and surviving on them as they sort of drifted around. There were a couple of atolls that became inhabited by ships that had gotten lost, and one that I know of was chronicled in World War Z, the book, and they talked about its destruction. So, it was its destruction at the hands of the Russian Navy, as far as I know. There were 3 nuclear subs that went missing, something like that, at least 2, maybe 3. And this place was destroyed because one of the subs had posted up there and was providing power. They were basically, they'd gone AWOL. So, this was a nuclear submarine, a ballistic missile submarine, not like nuclear powered, well, yes, nuclear powered, but also with nukes. There were, in fact, uses of nuclear weapons during World War Z. It was between India and Pakistan, which, it's frightening to me to see that nuclear weapons were used. The first time that they've been used since World War II, they were used in World War Z, and not even really against zombies, to my understanding. The countries that did not use nukes, being the rest of them, startling to me, and, I'm thankful for it. But, Russia never used nuclear weapons against zombies, to my knowledge. They may have. I wouldn't really put it past them. But they didn't use it, to my knowledge. The U.S. military did not use nuclear weapons, despite unloading basically their entire arsenal of other weapons on zombies during the Battle of Yonkers, before they figured out really how to deal with that. And it's often talked about, how did we lose Yonkers? Well, it was a combination of a lot of things, and it is heavily talked about in the book. But to my understanding, again, having, speaking as someone who was present at the Battle of Yonkers, we, and by we I mean the U.S. military, really figured that the weapons that we had would be more than enough to damage the zombies beyond repair. Thermobaric weapons, these weapons that create a large shockwave, you think would be enough to destroy the brain and to destroy parts of the body, and they were if you were close enough. But it turns out that zombie brains are a lot more resilient, sort of more like Play-Doh than Jell-O, I suppose. Not that brains are really like Jell-O, but, I assume you understand the picture. It's a little bit less mushy, a little bit more coagulated, The human brain is full of a lot of fluid, and a zombie brain, because they don't really have bodily fluids, is not. So it's more resistant to stuff like that. It's not to say it's dry in there. It's sort of this, I don't know how the hell to describe it. I've dealt with zombies a lot, but I'm really not sure how to describe it. It's more like dried blood, but it's not really dry. It's, I don't know what the right words are. There just aren't words in English language for what that quasi-fluid is like, that their brains are full of and suspended in, and that their veins are full of, and... Anyway, like the U.S. military, Russian generals had issues with figuring out how exactly to combat the zombies at first. As far as I understand, it was very difficult for them to do so. They didn't have the right kinds of weaponry, or they didn't have the right kinds of mobility. They didn't have enough mobility to get around to where the zombie hordes were, and stuff like that. They had a petroleum, gas problem, just like the U.S. had, except, maybe on a larger scale, because they were trying to mobilize their entire military instead of just their nuclear stuff. They had nuclear ships, although I'm not sure if any of them were functional. At least I can't recall if they were. I definitely didn't tussle with them at any point, which I'm very thankful for. But they, gosh, I don't know. They were able to recover their country just as much as we were. I'm not about to visit, but to my understanding, Russia is as good of a place as it was before the war, or at least as close to you can get when so much of your population is wiped out like that. So, sorry, I'm really hesitating because I managed to bring up Yonkers yet again, which is not something that I like to do. It is one of the, maybe not the darkest days, but certainly one of the scariest days of my life. And I witnessed carnage. I witnessed an impressive failure of intelligence, recon, understanding of the enemy. You know, it was when I learned, really, and as did many others, that these things we were fighting were not really human anymore. That these beings were much more resilient than we could have possibly imagined. That you can blow half of them away and they'll still keep crawling towards you with just as much resolve. You can riddle them with bullet holes and they won't care unless you turn their brains into splatters on a wall. Yeah. And that's a lot of what did it in, you know, between all the ordnance that was fired at the zombies and ultimately had such little effect compared to what people hoped for, to the meticulous training that the army gives out to aim for the center of mass because you're most likely to hit. It's not all that surprising looking back that Yonkers was as dismal a failure as it was. It was as much of a military move as it was a PR exercise, and frankly, it's disgusting. It's disgusting to see all of those resources and lives gone to waste that could have otherwise, well, could have otherwise not been. All that material, all those men, all that time, and it really did nothing except blow up some zombies, send some corpses flying, and show the rest of the world how unprepared we are. And I don't even mean we like the United States, but we like the world as a whole. You know, that was not that far into World War Z. It was not that far after the Great Panic. And after Yonkers, you can see this, you know, global panic that flared up again. You know, we saw it even on the zombie train, where we went back out to those towns that we were familiar with, and we basically got told, we're going to die, we're all going to die, because we can't seem to fight them. You know, even the people that had fought them on the small scale, people that had fought them house to house in their little towns, that had secured their towns, they realized that there are more zombies out there than we could have possibly imagined at the time. And it was scary. It was legitimately scary. And I stayed far away from large cities for a long, long time after that. And yet, they liked what I did. They appreciated my service at the Battle of Yonkers, which was sitting in a locomotive watching it all go down, and then hightailing it out of there with hundreds of men clinging to artillery cannons mounted on flat cars. You know, running down the side of the Hudson River, you know, reversing through Manhattan, just getting the hell out of Dodge. It's amazing. You know, I thank my lucky stars that I survived. But we turned it around, I guess. You know, we're in a better place now. Not that too many people really live in New York City now, anyway. But, you know, we're in a better place than we were back then. That's what I tell myself. War's over. War's over. But you never know when we might be in for round 2.